Now, the way I teach, I like to start with a legend. So we're good today. It's an ancient story, but only part of a legend. One of the most famous, and we can call it an epic, it truly is. One of the most famous of Hawaiian epics is the story of Hi'iake Kapoleo Pele. And it starts with Pele, who we know is the volcano goddess. And it's a very, very long story, but it starts with her coming to the islands. It starts with her having adventures and affairs. And then it switches over to Hi'iaka, who has her adventures and affairs. And it's a big, big, long, beautiful story. So today I'm just going to talk about a tiny, tiny part of the story. Hi'iaka was known as a healer. And she was the sister, the youngest sister of Pele. Now, her full name, I said, was Hi'iake Kapoleo Pele, which is usually translated as Hi'iaka in the bosom of Pele, with the connotation that she was the most beloved. Okay? So the story starts briefly. All Pele and her sisters were swimming here on Big Island, down at a beach called Ha'ena, which is in Ke'au. Okay? And Ha'ena means red hot. So metaphorically, it could also mean that the lava was flowing there when Pele was there. But anyway, they're swimming at the beach. Pele gets tired, goes to sleep, and while she's sleeping, her spirit body rises up, follows the sound of music all the way over to Kauai. There she sees and weds and woos and weds first, the chief Lohiau, very handsome young man. But her body is calling her back, so she has to leave. And so she comes all the way back, and then when she gets here, she gets her youngest sister, and we'll just call her Hi'iaka. The reason I put the whole name first was because all 8 of her sisters were called Hi'iaka. Hi'iaka this, Hi'iaka that, but we're only going to talk about the youngest, and we'll call her Hi'iaka. So she talked her into traveling physically all the way over to Kauai and bringing Lohiau back. Well, she did it, and she began, and she brought some friends with her, but we're not going to talk about the friends in this story, save a little time. And so she left Kilauea volcano here from this island. She went down above Hilo, through the forest, had wild adventures all the way over by Waimea, crossed over to Kauai, then went over to the different islands on her way, and had many kinds of adventures. And we're going to start the story where she finally gets to Kauai. And interestingly, she lands at a beach called Ha'ena, which is the same name, same meaning, but this one is on the north shore of Kauai. Now, she gets there. Now, Hi'iaka, you have to understand, she's considered a goddess, but she's also very human-like in many ways, but she has psychic abilities, she has some magical items, but she has a great intuition. She gets there and she immediately knows something is wrong. She immediately picks up that Lohiau is no longer living. But she doesn't really say anything about that right away. So immediately she goes to the sister of Lohiau, Kahana, make her name short, and asks what happened. Well, the sister is very upset with Pele because Pele came, he fell in love with her, and she blames the whole thing on Pele leaving and Lohiau getting so distraught because he couldn't handle that and virtually killing himself. Okay, that's Kahana's version of what happened. But we're looking at a version of this whole story that was written up in the newspapers in the 1800s in Hawaiian, and has fairly recently been translated. So this is the story we're looking at. So Hi'iaka immediately knows when she asks what happened. Well, he wasted away, and his skin all became yellow like an old tea leaf, and then finally he died. So Hi'iaka immediately picks up that he didn't do it himself, that his spirit, his living spirit, was captured by two witches. Now, we're going to call them witches. Hawaiian doesn't really have that word, but they do have words of sorcery and sorcerers. So these were women sorcerers that we can call witches. That's just easier to say. But it's bad witches, okay? I know there's a lot of good ones. These were bad. So they had stolen his living spirit, and Hi'iaka didn't know where it was. Now, she was shown a grave, but she knew that Lohiau was not in there. And so she kept tuning in, and finally she picks up that the witch sisters, Kilioi and Kalana were their names, and that they were starting to try and get to her mind and keep her from searching for Lohiau. And she figured out where they resided. And they resided on the north shore of Kauai. At the end of the road was a place called Ke'e. And it's a place with green sand. It's a beautiful lagoon, and it's the beginning of the path that goes up to the Napali. But the witches were on the cliff of Ke'e. Now, the cliff of Ke'e is where there are the remains of an old Hula temple. There's actually two temples on that little point that juts out from the straight cliff. And Hi'iaka knew that they were up there, so she begins climbing the cliff. And so she's climbing away on the cliff, and the sisters are shouting at her and cursing her and threatening her. And finally, when she keeps coming, they start throwing down boulders, and they cause waterfalls to flow down to try and knock her off the cliff. And Hi'iaka has to struggle, but she's determined, and she keeps doing it, and she keeps going up. And finally, she does get to the top, where the path begins, and they aren't there, so she starts along the path. Now it's an 11, as she's climbing, she hears their voices, and she hears a third voice, and it's very soft, and it's kind of ghostly, and it comes out and it says, "Please help me. I'm at Kalalau. Come and get me." And this is the voice of Lohiau's spirit. So that's how she knows where to go. So she gets to the top, the sisters aren't there, she starts following the path on this very, very narrow, some of you probably have been there, but it's a very, very narrow path with sheer cliffs, sometimes as much thousands of feet straight down into the sea. But there's a point where the path dips down all the way to the level of the ocean. It's called Hanakapiai. And it has some flat area there. And Hi'iaka just gets into there when these two dragons jump her. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background information. They're, in the story, they're called mo'o. Mo'o in Hawaiian can mean lizard or anything similar. And there are lots of stories of giant dragons, giant lizards if you want to, but giant dragons in these islands. And different islands have different stories about this. And in the Pele stories, they're always associated with sorcerers who are in conflict with Pele and her sisters and her family. So that's why they took the form of dragons, and they leaped on and tried to claw her and pounce and bite. But Hi'iaka had not only her own strength and skill, she had a magic skirt. And I've always wondered how it worked. But anyway, she takes the skirt and she flaps the skirt and lightning shoots out. So she's knocking the sisters, the dragons, over there, and sometimes they fall into ash, but then they have quickly reform. They have powerful magic they had too. And all day long, Hi'iaka's battling, and she's getting tired, but she keeps going. And so finally, in the last battle, she wipes them out completely. So then she goes on, all the way to Kalalau Valley. Kalalau Valley, along this coast, about a 15-mile stretch where there's no road. There's these very, very steep mountains that come down to the sea, and these very narrow valleys. Along that area, Kalalau is one of the widest, but it still has these extremely sharp and steep mountains surrounding it. So that's where he was. Now, in these valleys along that coast, what they'd often do in the old time, the ancient days, was there would be caves, remnants of lava tubes, and these were places that were made sacred, and they would hide the bodies or the bones of chiefs, and especially in Kalalau, the high chiefs, and they'd be in the cliff walls someplace. Okay? And I happen to know this personally because Susan and I and some friends, I think you were with us that time, yeah, Susan and I and some friends were on a different valley, but we had climbed up one of the steep walls and accidentally found one of these caves. The only reason we found it was because it had been sealed up with rocks, and there must have been an earthquake or something that had knocked a few of the rocks out. And so we went up, and we wouldn't go in it, but we peeked in, and we saw a full outrigger canoe. And on the thwart, which was the seat right in the center of the canoe, there was a bundle of tapa cloth. Now, from knowing about Hawaiian culture, we know that in that bundle were the bones. And it had to be a chief. Only a chief would be buried like that. But they had to be the bones. And then sitting on top of the bundle was a skull. So we sealed up the cave again, thinking that on our next trip, we'd come back and take another look. We came back, couldn't find it. It's like it never existed. Okay? Very curious. But anyway, that shows you how those things were done and how this might have been. So she got to Kalalau, Iaka did, and climbed up the cliff. She heard the voice guiding her, and so she found the cave where Lohiau was, and she went inside the cave, and there was his body. Usually they do all the bones, but here was his body, and it was lifeless. And she searched around, used her intuition, and she found a calabash, which is a bowl, and had a cover on it, and inside that bowl was where they kept his living spirit. So now she's got to get back. She carries Lohiau, puts the bowl on his stomach, walks out to the edge of the cliff, calls upon the winds of Kalalau. And the winds come up, and she steps off the cliff and into the arms of the wind, and the winds carry her all the way back to Ha'ena. So now there she is in Ha'ena. Now, before she left, she had made orders, goddess after all, she had given orders for a hut to be made. To be made a pretty large hut, but to be made and thatched with tea leaf. And because they didn't usually use tea leaf for thatching, only special occasions. The tea plant, T-I, if you're not familiar, is to a great degree today, but even more so in the past, it was a very sacred plant. And sometimes used for blessings and sometimes used for spiritual protection, depending on the particular family. Here it was going to be used for healing, because it was always also used for that. So it had all this healing mana on this hut. So then she sends out a servant to gather very special types of plants, all the beautiful plants of the forest. Among these are iee vines, maile leaves, brought back lehua blossoms, and all the best ones, and the ones that we're very familiar with in using in the hula as well. So, and she didn't, one version says that she lined the hut with all of these leaves, but she did a lot more than that. She started conducting a ritual. She laid down before she laid the body down completely, she had a friend of hers make all of these different plants into leis. So there were leis of iee vine, leis of maile, leis of lehua, and she had all these leis made. And one lei right down the center represented the equator. the path of Wakea, which is what they call the equator, which means the very center. Okay? And so Lohiau was laid down, his body was laid down on that. She also then had another lay, was on the north side, to represent the path of Kane, which was actually the Tropic of Cancer. And then the path on the other side of the hut was the path of Kanaloa, which was the Tropic of Capricorn. And the idea behind all of this was that these were the boundaries of life and death. And in order for the healing to be successful, life had to be centered on the path of Wakea. And so with that, she began performing a ritual. Those were the ritual objects she set up. She got some water and put them in special gourds, but water from a spring and water from the heavens, rain, and she had those ready by the side, one at his head. She then began chanting, and she chanted chants that particularly had to do with the nights of the moon, because Hawaii had a moon, and every night its own name, and that name had its own meaning. Now, in the story, it goes through every single night and what she did, and we're not going to do that. But she started on the night called Muku, which is the dark of the moon. And because Muku means cut off, and Lohiau had been cut off from life. So she started on that night. And she starts doing the chanting, and she starts sprinkling the water. And so this goes on night after night. And the one interesting one I want to bring in is on the 11th night, starting from the first, or it's the 12th night starting from Muku, is called Huna. And Huna is the name of the esoteric knowledge of Hawaii, and it also means hidden. Because now, and there's a proverb that's used, Ahuwali kahuna, that which was hidden shall be revealed. And this is what part of it has to do, but that's when the real healing began, because that's when she took his spirit, put it into a gourd, put the gourd by his nose, and forced the spirit into his nostrils. And that was on the night of Huna she did this. And then she began massaging him, so that the spirit would go through all parts of his body until it finally got centered, which is in Hawaiian, this is the center. And so it got centered in the middle of the body, in the piko, which means center. Right? So now there's beginning to be life. He's beginning to breathe, but he's not fully conscious. So on that same night is when she sprinkled the water on his eyes, and his eyes opened. But he still couldn't move very well. So she continued the chanting, she continued all the healing that she could do, all the way until she got to the night of Akua. Now, when we look at the moon, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are actually 3 full moons, 3 nights of a full moon. And the Hawaiians recognize this. And so the first night is Akua, which means spirit. The second night is Hoku, which means star. And the third night is Mahealani. And that's the one that was considered the fullest. So she began on Akua, and she began not only just massaging him, but anointing his body with special oils. And as she began doing this, he gradually began to get some of his, first a little bit of gasping, and then a little bit of speech. And then as she continued throughout the rest of the month and all the nights, he got more and more strong and more strong. And by the time it was almost over, he was able to get up, he was able to move around, he was beginning to eat a little bit of food. He started with poi. And until finally, on the next night of Muku, the final ritual was done on that night, because Muku still means cut off, but this time he was cut off from death. And he came out, and he was all ready to go and feeling strong and vigorous, and by this time he had fallen in love with Hi'iaka. But That's another part of the legend, and we're not going to go into that one today. Yes. Every night had a special type of healing that went with it, and special type of chant that went with it. Okay. And so that was the end of the story. So goes the story. Now, the topic that we're talking about is how to be a healer. Now, first of all, the most important thing to understand first is that healers don't heal. In the alternative type of healing today, they use another word. It's called a facilitator. Okay? The healer is actually a helper, because the healing always comes from inside, comes from within the person, has to come from the person. Doesn't matter how good a healer is, no matter how skilled, how famous, how powerful, there's no healing unless what we call the healee participates in the healing. It's like there's a joke, I'm not doing this to put him down, but it's a common joke in hospitals. The operation was a success, but the patient died. The skill was used, everything worked perfectly, okay? It was all done correctly, but the patient didn't live. Okay? The healing's got to come from inside. So we use the word healer really as a courtesy title. Now that helping can be very, very important. And as you get better and better, you're applying skill and you're applying knowledge and you get better at what you're doing, but as a healer, you can only take responsibility for your level of experience and how well you apply it. You cannot take responsibility for the healing. And I know there are a lot of healers who love to do that. Makes them feel really good when what they do helps. That was true of the witch doctors and the Kauai healers of the past, as well as anybody else who get caught up in it. Wow, success! And then ignore the ones that don't work. Okay? But it's because the healing has to come from inside. Anybody can do healing. And I'll be telling you ways. But anybody can do healing. It's like, as long as you have the desire to help, that's what it requires. Just like anybody with fingers can learn how to play the piano. But if you want to play the piano well, then that takes an awful lot of practice and an awful lot of study. It's the same with healing. You get better and better as you acquire skill and knowledge. But you can start off with what you've got at any moment and do some wonderful, powerful healing too. Because what you're doing is helping a person who wants to get better. And there's lots of ways to do that. Just for the sake of convenience, I've divided up the different kinds of healing so that we can talk about them. So we can talk about visual healing, auditory healing, kinesthetic healing, and energetic healing. And so what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at visual healing first. Visual healing can be done with pictures, with paintings, with photography. I have a Facebook page and an awful lot of Facebook friends, and one of the things I love to do when I go on is look at all the exquisite photographs that people have posted. I mean, beautiful, inspirational. It's a joy to look at them. That's a very healing thing. It can be done with flower arrangements. It can be done with imagination. It can be done with any visual representation of beauty and harmony, which are the essence of being healthy and whole. Yeah? So anything visual can be, even, might as well mention it too, I didn't mention that, but handicraft, sculpture, anything which you look at makes you feel good has a healing effect. So that's one of them, the visual side. The auditory healing can be words. There's a lot of healing done with words. helping people to kind of redirect their thinking and see things differently or think of things differently. That's a very powerful way, and it can be done in simple ways too. It can be done with singing. It can be done with the sound of other things, sound of music of different kinds, of drumming, of all kinds of auditory healing possibilities exist. Anything which you can hear, which gives a sense of harmony and inspiration and beauty, helps a healing. The kinesthetic ways. Well, kinesthetically, massage, of course, that comes to mind right away, but so does hugging. Hugging is very healing. Any kind of a loving touch is very healing. I think probably some of you know this, but some years ago there was a study done in Florida University where they had a hospital and they had premature babies. And to experiment with that, they had volunteers. Now this shows you how powerful it is, because I gave this talk this morning as well, but I'll tell you about that later. But someone asked, well, don't you have to be really skilled as the healer? Well, no, because this experiment showed that. They had volunteers from the university to come in, and what they had to do for a few minutes out of each hour, reach through with a plastic glove into the incubator where the baby was, and stroke its skin. Now they're not even stroking it with their own hand. They're stroking the skin. And they'd do that while they're reading their studies, you know. There was no thought to it. And yet, the babies who had been stroked gained weight faster and were able to be discharged 3 days sooner than the other children who had not been touched. And just from that minimal amount of touch. Okay? Very powerful. So it doesn't have to be fancy. But along with kinesthetic also comes the ideas of anything that you put into the body, like food. Food can be very healing. I know after I've eaten one of Gloria's meals, I feel really, really good. Yeah, so they're very healing. But people do this in a way. A good chef knows that too. So that's one way. We also have to leave the surgery and the drug therapy, which is also kinesthetic, but leave that to the experts. But there's all sorts of other ways. Any kind of movement. Dance is another example. Dance can be very healing. Okay? Any kind of movement that gets a sense of beauty and harmony and inspiration can be used for healing. Then finally we have energetic healing. Now, we hear a lot today about energy healing, but energetic healing includes breathing. Okay? That's why we breathe. We breathe for energy. And so breath can be used in the most fundamental way. We have gravity. If you have sometimes they have certain kinds of machines that help a person's circulation, help to readjust the bone structure or whatever, and they hang them upside down or something like that. That's gravity. That's energy healing. Magnetism, electricity. Also, however, when we're talking about energy like this, we're talking about what we can call bioenergy. This would be the kind of thing where people, they call it a laying on of hands, but you don't always have to actually touch the person, okay? But you're directing your energy or letting energy come through you, however you want to think of it. And in addition to that, you have the what we call subtle energy. And there's a lot of different kinds of devices that use this, that have been put together, and that can be homemade as well. And then feng shui. Feng shui is an energy healing. It's the way you organize in the environment, and that can be a type of healing. Back in the visual healing, I wanted to mention also landscaping is another kind. That can be very healing by itself. So these are all different kinds of healings. And there's all kinds of levels and varieties and types. You don't need a diploma, you don't need a certificate, you don't need someone's authorization to start healing. Unless the type of healing you're doing requires that. And then you play by the rules. But just to start healing in some of these ways, you don't need any of that. What you need is a kind, at the very minimum, right? Minimum, kind touch, kind word, kind feeling. You can be sitting next to someone who's not feeling so good, and if you can generate a feeling of compassion and goodness in your job, that's all it requires. It requires the desire to help. The ways are innumerable. So, do we have any questions or comments? Yes.
You mentioned a lot of styles and techniques for healing. Is there any commonality that you can point to with why they all work?
Oh, why they all work? They all work when they help a person to feel good. That's what is the common factor. If they don't help a person to feel good, some people want to get well so badly, they'll get well in spite of the treatment. And sometimes they get well because the treatment hurts so much, they want to get well and get rid of it. Okay? But to think that you can help to heal somebody by trying to kill them is really strange. Okay? The real feedback of good healing is healing that helps someone feel better. But like I said, that urge to heal, when it's there, will manifest itself somehow or other, with or without help. But with help, it's so much easier and so much more fun. Anything else?
Self-healing.
About what? Self-healing? Oh, sure. That's the only one that you really need to take responsibility for. Okay? There has grown up among some traditions the idea that I have explored in depth that for some reason which is never clearly explained, you're not supposed to be able to heal yourself. And so I would put those traditions aside, because the fact from experience is that that's the only kind of healing that can happen for yourself. It's got to be you doing it. Now, you can do it consciously or just trust spirit in your body and let it happen. That works sometimes. Works best when body, mind, and spirit are working together. But it's the same thing. You can breathe. You can surround yourself with good energy. You can eat good foods that feel good to you, that your body likes and responds to. See? That's the difference, because not everybody's the same. And different people in the same part of the world, as well as different people in different parts of the world, like and use different kinds of food to help them. And what do we eat food for? That's for healing. That's why we eat it. It's to get our body functioning smoothly and better. That's not the only reason nowadays. Nowadays we do it a lot socially and emotionally, and that gets us into trouble. But the fundamental purpose is to make us feel good and to be healthy, to be able to move, to be able to live, to be able to love. So self-healing is simply any technique that's appropriate applied to yourself. There have been people who have actually taken bullets out of themselves and sewn it up. Okay, so there's virtually no type of healing that you cannot apply to yourself. Anything else? Yes.
I've heard you say something about why we try to heal so fast. Why do we try to heal quickly?
Oh, well, what that's coming from is in our tradition. We look for the techniques that help us heal most effectively and most quickly. And the idea is to get healed as fast as possible so we have more time to party. Okay? Because learning how to party well is the reason why we're here on this earth. Okay? That's why we do so much of it, and that's why it feels so good. We move toward pleasure and away from pain. A lot of people have gotten mixed up about that. They think we got other reasons for being here. But some of us have the purpose in mind to help the earth and turn Earth into the party planet of the universe. We're working on it. But we still have a lot of teaching to go. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
I guess when it comes to self-healing and trying to help others in that same respect, is there anything we can do to kind of protect ourselves, make sure that we don't spend more time to help others?
Okay. Well, okay, let's put in those terms. All right. This is difficult because, yes, there is things you can do, but it's got to come from inside. It has to come from a personal decision to work with your own problems and to find ways to heal those things. Because no one else can force you to look at them or to deal with them. When they try, you'll set up so much resistance, you'll be blocking yourself worse than before. Now, here's something that can help. If you can establish a practice, if you can turn it into a habit even better, but if you can establish a practice of taking time out to totally relax into the present moment. Okay? And I'm not talking about the kind of relaxation where you want your mind to go elsewhere or anything like that. I mean sensory present. And if you can just do that as a, some people think of it as a Zen thing, but it's really a human thing. When you are relaxed in the present moment, ideas and inspirations for healing your problems tend to come to you more easily. You don't have to think about them yourself. That's why I say it's a fairly easy practice to do because it feels good too. But when you're in that state, you're opening yourself up to inspiration. Now, it doesn't have to come from your higher self or from spirit or from God or from angels. It could. It could also come from, while you're doing that, you just happen to have the urge to pick up a book and there's your answer. You can turn on the television and somebody's saying the exact same thing you need to hear. But from that centeredness in the present, it opens the doors to that kind of thing. The opportunities, either the self-healing itself or the opportunities to do something about it.
Well, I guess the reason I asked the question is because I think, sometimes for myself, I find that it's easier to feel like if I still have something I need to work on for myself, it's easier to help others. If I'm not.
Well, sure, if that helps you, work on yourself.
Yeah. But
Sure.
that's the thing is I think it's important to help ourselves against others.
Sure, it's just as important, but you don't have to do one or the other. Okay? Often what I find when I'm doing healing work with people, in the process, I get ideas of things that I can use for myself as well. I find myself saying things that I didn't expect to say, and they're useful things that I want to remember. Okay? So yeah, and the reason is this. When you're fully involved in the process of healing, okay, like massage, I don't mean doing massage mindlessly, I mean fully involved in the process, you are expanding yourself. You're expanding your energy, you're releasing tensions because you're no longer focused on your problems, and that helps to relax an awful lot of muscles. And so here you are in that state of expansion, and you get ideas and inspiration for helping yourself. And sometimes you get healed while you're helping someone else. Yeah.